Chapter 1. The Beginning of Autumn. The golden rays of the autumn sun filtered through the large bay windows of Serendipity Books, casting warm, dappled light across the hardwood floors. Outside, the trees of Ashwood Falls had already begun their brilliant transformation, with leaves turning shades of amber, scarlet, and gold. The air carried that unmistakable crispness, the kind that makes you breathe in just a little deeper, savoring the scent of wood smoke and freshly fallen leaves. Inside the bookstore, Jasmine Edwards stood atop a small wooden ladder, carefully hanging an orange and burgundy banner that read, "Welcome Fall," in swirling cursive. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, her favorite time of year, when the world seemed to slow down and take a collective sigh of relief after the bustle of summer. The bookstore itself was the epitome of coziness, with its mismatched armchairs tucked into corners, shelves stacked high with books, and small inviting nooks just begging to be occupied by readers. Jasmine stepped down from the ladder and took a moment to admire her handiwork. The banner was perfectly centered. Below it, she'd arranged a display of classic autumn reads: Anne of Green Gables, Dracula, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and her personal favorite, The Secret History. Beside the books, small glass jars held cinnamon sticks, which filled the store with the comforting aroma of fall spices. She brushed a strand of her dark, curly hair from her face and smiled, feeling a sense of contentment she rarely allowed herself. "I think that looks pretty perfect, don't you, Graham?" Jasmine said softly, glancing at the framed photo of her grandmother that sat behind the checkout counter. Her grandmother, the original owner of Serendipity Books, had passed away 2 years ago, leaving Jasmine with the bookstore and a legacy of warmth and wisdom. The store was a sanctuary, both for Jasmine and the people of Ashwood Falls, and it was up to her to carry that forward. Her heart ached for a moment, thinking about the countless hours she'd spent with her grandmother in this very spot, drinking tea, discussing books, and laughing over the antics of the quirky customers who came in and out. Graham had always said that books were more than just stories. They were an escape, a comfort, and a way to understand the world. And Jasmine had taken that to heart. Sighing contentedly, she turned her attention to the task at hand. Today was the first official day of autumn, and she had big plans for the season. She'd already brewed a fresh pot of apple cider, the sweet and tart aroma wafting through the store, and set out a platter of pumpkin-spiced cookies, just as her grandmother had done every year. Her hands moved on autopilot, adjusting the placement of a ceramic pumpkin here, a string of fairy lights there, until the entire store glowed with a warm, autumnal charm. As she moved to straighten a stack of books near the entrance, the brass bell above the door jingled softly, signaling the arrival of her first customer of the day. Jasmine looked up, expecting to see Mrs. Turner, the elderly woman who came in every Thursday morning to borrow a new romance novel. But instead, the man who stepped into the store was decidedly not Mrs. Turner. He was tall, very tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway for a moment before he stepped inside. His hair, a rich shade of chestnut, was slightly tousled, as if he had just run his hand through it. He wore a dark wool coat, unbuttoned to reveal a simple sweater underneath, and his jeans had the kind of worn, comfortable look that suggested they were his favorite pair. His eyes were a striking shade of blue, like the sky on a crisp autumn day, and when they met Jasmine's, her breath caught in her throat for just a second. Hi," Jasmine blurted out, mentally kicking herself for sounding so awkward. She was usually better with customers, especially the ones who looked like they belonged on the cover of one of those brooding romance novels in the back corner. The man smiled, and Jasmine could swear her heart did a little somersault. "Hi," he said, his voice deep but soft, with just a hint of something she couldn't quite place. Maybe it was exhaustion, or was that vulnerability? "I'm, just looking," he added, as if he needed to justify his presence in the bookstore. "Well, you've come to the right place for that," Jasmine said, her voice steadying as she fell back into her usual rhythm. "We've got books for every kind of mood. Looking for something light and fun or dark and brooding? Or, just a book on how to survive being ridiculously handsome?" Oh my God, did I just say that out loud? Jasmine could feel her face heating up as the words left her mouth, and she immediately busied herself with rearranging a stack of bookmarks as if that would somehow erase her awkwardness. The man chuckled, and to her surprise, there was no trace of arrogance in his expression, just amusement. "I'll keep that last one in mind," he said, his blue eyes twinkling with humor. "But for now, I'm just looking for something to help with. Well, let's call it a bit of writer's block." Jasmine's curiosity piqued. "Writer's block?" she asked, glancing up from her bookmarks. "You're a writer?" "Something like that," he said, his smile fading just a little. "Evan Bennett." Jasmine froze, the name clicking into place. "Wait, the Evan Bennett? As in New York Times bestselling author Evan Bennett? That Evan Bennett?" Evan winced, clearly not enjoying the recognition. "Yeah, that Evan Bennett. But please, just Evan." Jasmine blinked, trying to process the fact that one of her favorite authors was standing in front of her. She had devoured his books, gritty, emotional novels with characters so real they practically leapt off the page. And now, here he was, in her bookstore, looking like he'd just stepped out of a magazine spread for R&D Hotties of the Year. "Oh, wow," Jasmine managed to say, feeling the blush creeping back up her neck. "I mean, it's just, wow. I'm a huge fan of your work. I read Unwritten at least 3 times. Evan smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes this time. "Thanks. That one was a lot to write." Jasmine could sense there was more to that statement, but she didn't push. Instead, she did what she always did when someone came into the store feeling a little lost. She offered a book. "Well, if you're looking for something to shake off that writer's block, I've got just the thing." She moved to one of the shelves and pulled out a well-worn copy of The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. It's not a novel, but it's a great book for creative types. Helps you clear your mind. Get unstuck. Evan took the book from her, his fingers brushing hers briefly in the process. His touch was warm, and for a moment, Jasmine's mind went completely blank. "Thanks," he said, glancing at the cover. "I'll give it a shot." Jasmine nodded, trying to ignore the little flutter in her chest. "Anytime. And, if you ever need a quiet place to write, the reading nook in the back is usually pretty empty. Unless Mrs. Turner's here. Then you'll just have to listen to her commentary on Fabio's flowing locks." Evan laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to light up his entire face. "I'll keep that in mind." As he moved toward the back of the store, Jasmine leaned against the counter, her thoughts racing. She had no idea why Evan Bennett, best-selling author and all-around heartthrob, had ended up in Ashwood Falls. But one thing was clear. This autumn was about to get a whole lot more interesting. Evan found a spot near the window, the quiet ambiance of the bookstore already beginning to soothe the chaos in his mind. He glanced over at Jasmine, who was now helping another customer with a stack of mystery novels. There was something about her, something calming, like a cup of warm tea on a cold day. She was beautiful in that effortless way, with her dark curls and warm brown eyes that seemed to see right through the walls he'd built around himself. Stop it, he thought to himself. He wasn't here for distractions. He was here to write, to clear his head, to escape the mess his life had become after the breakup. The tabloids had had a field day with it, and the last thing he needed was more complications. But as he opened the book Jasmine had given him and settled into the soft armchair, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, this bookstore, and its owner, were exactly what he needed. Jasmine, meanwhile, couldn't stop sneaking glances at Evan from behind the counter. It wasn't just that he was handsome, though wow, he really was. But there was something more. A heaviness behind his eyes, a quiet sadness that reminded her of someone trying to carry too much weight on their own. She shook her head, scolding herself silently. She didn't even know the guy, and already she was trying to analyze him like one of the characters in her favorite books. But still, as the leaves fluttered down from the trees outside and the cozy warmth of autumn wrapped around the bookstore, she couldn't help but wonder, what kind of story would unfold here at Serendipity Books this season? Chapter 2. Book Recommendations and Friendly Conversations. The next few days seemed to melt away in a warm blur of cozy afternoons and quiet mornings, with Evan finding his way back to Serendipity Books more often than either of them had anticipated. For Jasmine, it was as if autumn had sprinkled a bit of magic over her little bookstore, transforming what had always been a peaceful retreat into something much more alive. She didn't want to admit how much she looked forward to hearing the soft jingle of the brass bell every time Evan walked through the door. And there he was again today, right on schedule. The moment the door chimed, Jasmine glanced up from her position behind the counter. As if by instinct, she found herself tucking an errant curl behind her ear, her pulse quickening just slightly. Evan stepped inside, pausing in the entryway like he always did, taking in the bookstore as if it were the first time he was seeing it. He glanced over at her, and the corners of his mouth lifted in that small half-smile she was starting to become a little too familiar with. Today he wore a soft gray sweater and jeans, and he had that slightly rumpled look, like he'd just rolled out of bed, but still somehow managed to make it look intentional. "Back again?" Jasmine teased, her tone light. "I'm starting to think you're avoiding something. Either that, or I should start charging rent for the reading nook." Evan chuckled, moving towards the counter with an easy stride. "Can't a guy just enjoy a good bookstore without ulterior motives?" He shot back, his eyes twinkling with amusement. Jasmine arched an eyebrow. "Not unless you're secretly planning to steal my top-secret apple cider recipe. That, or you're working up the courage to join Mrs. Turner's Fabio fan club. I hear membership requires deep commitment and a lot of tolerance for shirtless romance covers." Evan leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. "I'll have you know I've been tempted by both, though I'm still on the fence about Fabio. I'm more of a Mr. Darcy guy." Jasmine couldn't help but laugh. "Mr. Darcy, huh? I wouldn't have pegged you for a Pride and Prejudice fan." He shrugged. "It's a classic for a reason, right? Though, to be fair, Darcy is way too brooding for his own good. Couldn't have hurt him to smile once in a while." "Well, you're already ahead of him in that department," Jasmine said, surprising herself with how easily the compliment slipped out. Her eyes widened just a little, and she quickly turned to grab a book from behind the counter, using the motion to distract herself. Smooth Jasmine. Real smooth. Evan, to his credit, didn't seem fazed by it. In fact, his smile grew just a touch, and he leaned in slightly as if to keep their conversation close and intimate. "Speaking of books," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone, "I've been working through The Artist's Way. It's different, but it's helping." Jasmine glanced up, meeting his gaze. "Different is good, sometimes. It shakes things up, gets you out of your head." She hesitated for a second, then asked, "Do you think you'll finish your new book soon?" Evan's expression faltered for a brief moment, a shadow passing over his face. He looked away, as if gathering his thoughts, before replying, I hope so. This one's been harder than the others. It's like the words just don't want to come. Jasmine nodded, understanding more than she cared to admit. That's the tricky thing about stories, she said softly. Sometimes they get stuck, and you feel like you're trying to force something that just doesn't want to be told yet. He looked back at her, and for a moment, it felt like they were sharing more than just words about writing. Yeah, he murmured. Exactly. There was a quiet between them that wasn't awkward, just a natural pause, like the moment you take to turn the page of a book before diving back in. Jasmine's heart did a small, involuntary flip. It was strange how comfortable she felt around him, like they'd known each other far longer than a few days. Yet, at the same time, there was an undeniable tension, a pull she hadn't anticipated. Quickly, she cleared her throat and pushed the book she'd grabbed towards him. Well, if you liked The Artist's Way, you might enjoy this one. It's called Bird by Anne Lamott. It's one of my go-to reads for when I'm feeling stuck. Funny, insightful, and a good reminder that writing doesn't always have to be perfect. It just has to get done. Evan picked up the book, studying the cover. I think you're trying to convert me to your secret writing cult. Jasmine grinned. Maybe, but you'll thank me later when you're rolling in royalties for your next bestseller. He laughed, the sound warm and infectious. I'll hold you to that. He glanced back at her, and there was a flicker of something in his expression, something more than just friendly banter. But just as quickly, he turned away, his focus returning to the book in his hands. As Evan wandered off toward the reading nook, Jasmine exhaled slowly, letting her eyes linger on his retreating figure. It was becoming a habit, this silent observation. She couldn't help it. Every time he walked through the door, it was as though the atmosphere of the bookstore shifted just a little, becoming lighter, more charged with the possibility of something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Over the next few days, Evan became something of a regular fixture at Serendipity. Some mornings, he'd arrive as the bell on the door still echoed through the quiet space, offering a quick nod and smile, before disappearing into the reading nook with whatever book Jasmine had recommended. Other days, he'd linger at the counter, his presence a welcome distraction as they swapped stories about their favorite authors, their least favorite book endings, and everything in between. You're telling me you didn't like the ending of Gone with the Wind? Jasmine asked incredulously one afternoon, her arms crossed as she leaned against the counter. Evan shrugged, lounging in the chair across from her, one ankle resting over his knee. I'm just saying, Scarlett had it coming. Rhett was too good for her. Jasmine narrowed her eyes, pointing a finger at him. That's blasphemy. Rhett was just as bad as she was. They were perfectly awful for each other, and that's why it worked. Or didn't work, Evan countered, smirking. Jasmine rolled her eyes. I swear sometimes I don't even know why I let you in here. He grinned, resting his head against the back of the chair. Because deep down, you know I'm right. You just don't want to admit it. Or maybe I just like a good tragic love story. Jasmine shot back, moving to stack a few returned books onto the shelf. Evan's smile softened, and for a brief moment, his gaze lingered on her. Yeah, I guess tragic love stories have their appeal, he said, his voice quieter than before. There was something in the way he said it, a weight behind the words that made Jasmine pause mid-motion. She turned to look at him, catching the faraway look in his eyes. He was somewhere else, lost in thoughts she couldn't follow. Hey, she said gently, taking a step closer. You, okay? Evan blinked, snapping out of whatever memory had caught him. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking. Jasmine didn't push. She recognized that look. The kind people wore when they were carrying something too heavy to share with the world just yet. She'd worn it herself once or twice. Instead, she changed the subject, offering him a small smile. You know, if Rhett and Scarlet aren't your thing, maybe you probably Persuasion by Jane Austen again. It's tragic in all the right ways, but with a little more hope at the end. Evan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Austen, huh? All right, hit me with it. I'll give it another go. Jasmine laughed, grabbing a copy of Persuasion from the shelf and tossing it to him. He caught it with ease, flipping through the pages absent-mindedly. I'm serious, Jasmine said, a playful lilt to her voice. You'll thank me later. Evan chuckled, shaking his head. I think you just like torturing me with these heavy romances. She shrugged innocently. It's my way of keeping things interesting. Chapter 3. Past Hurts Resurface. The crisp air of Ashwood Falls nipped at Evan Bennett's cheeks as he walked through the park, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. Autumn had fully descended upon the town, painting the trees in a riot of colors. Brilliant oranges, deep reds, and golden yellows. It was the kind of postcard-perfect scene that made people fall in love with small towns, especially ones like Ashwood Falls. But for Evan, the peaceful surroundings only magnified the disquiet in his mind. His breath misted in front of him as he walked aimlessly, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound for miles. The park was nearly empty this late in the afternoon, and Evan appreciated the solitude. But even in the stillness, he couldn't escape his thoughts. It had been nearly 6 months since the breakup with Danielle. 6 months since his personal life had become front-page news, splashed across every tabloid and gossip site imaginable. He could still see the headlines. Best-selling author's heartbreak, Evan Bennett and supermodel split. The invasion of privacy had been brutal, and the fallout had left him emotionally raw and bitter. Everywhere he went, people looked at him like they knew him, as if they had the right to dissect every part of his relationship. What no one knew, though, was how much he had given up to keep that relationship going. How much of himself he'd lost. Danielle had been dazzling. She was the kind of woman who commanded attention just by walking into a room. But behind the beauty and glamour, their relationship had been fragile, built on appearances and convenience rather than anything real. When it ended, it wasn't just the public embarrassment that stung. It was the realization that he'd spent years with someone who never truly understood him. Now, with every step through the park, Evan felt the weight of that failure pressing down on him. He'd thrown himself into his work after the breakup, hoping to drown the heartache in his writing. But it hadn't worked. The words wouldn't come. It was like the writer in him had dried up, just as his love life had. And then, out of nowhere, Ashwood Falls. A quiet escape. A place where no one knew him, where he could hide away from the spotlight and hopefully find his muse again. Except, of course, it wasn't that simple. Jasmine Edwards had surprised him. At first, he'd thought she was just another small-town girl, polite, quiet, and perfectly content in her little bookstore. But the more time he spent at Serendipity Books, the more he realized how wrong he'd been. Jasmine had layers, hidden depths that both intrigued and unsettled him. She was kind, yes, but also witty, sharp, and fiercely passionate about her books and her life. She wasn't flashy or loud like Danielle, but in her quiet way, she was magnetic. And that terrified him. The more time he spent with Jasmine, the more he could feel himself softening, letting his guard down in a way he hadn't in years. But every time he felt that pull toward her, a voice in the back of his head reminded him of what had happened the last time he'd let someone in. The betrayal. The heartache. The headlines. He couldn't go through that again. Not now. Not with her. Evan stopped by the edge of the small pond in the center of the park, watching as a few ducks glided lazily across the water. His reflection stared back at him from the rippling surface. His face slightly paler than usual, his blue eyes dull with fatigue. He'd been running from his problems for so long that he wasn't sure how to stop. The writer's block, the emotional baggage, the lingering fear of opening his heart again, it all weighed him down, making it impossible to move forward. Could he really trust someone again? Especially someone like Jasmine, who seemed so pure, untouched by the darkness of the world he'd been living in? With a sigh, Evan turned away from the pond and headed back toward the bookstore, unsure of what tomorrow would bring, but knowing that, sooner or later, he'd have to confront his past. Jasmine stood at the counter in Serendipity Books, her fingers idly tracing the edge of an old leather-bound book. She should have been focused. There were new inventory orders to place, a window display to organize, and a dozen other small tasks that kept the bookstore running smoothly. But her mind was elsewhere, drifting back to thoughts of Evan Bennett. It had been a few weeks since he'd first walked through the door, and in that time, they'd settled into an easy rhythm of friendly conversation and shared book recommendations. He was charming, no doubt, but there was a heaviness to him, something he kept buried beneath the surface. Jasmine knew better than to pry, but she couldn't help but wonder what had led him to Ashwood Falls, and why he seemed so guarded. It wasn't just him, though. Jasmine had her own ghosts to contend with. Her ex, Richard, had been the exact opposite of Evan. Where Evan was mysterious and introspective, Richard had been outgoing and charismatic, sweeping her off her feet in a whirlwind romance. For a time, she'd thought they were perfect for each other. But as the months passed, it became clear that they were heading in different directions. Richard wanted a life filled with excitement, trips, parties, and endless socializing. Jasmine, on the other hand, found peace in the quiet corners of her bookstore, in the way a story could transport her to another world, without ever leaving her seat. The end of their relationship had been inevitable, but that didn't make it hurt any less. Richard had accused her of being too boring, too settled in her ways. "You're too comfortable," he'd said during their last argument, frustration etched across his face. "You don't want more out of life, Jasmine. You're content with your little bookstore, your small-town routine. But that's not enough for me." Those words had stung, cutting deep in a way she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't that Jasmine didn't want more out of life. She just wanted different things. She wanted stability, a quiet kind of love, the kind you found in the pages of a well-worn novel, not the frantic, all-consuming drama that Richard seemed to crave. Now, as she thought about Evan, she couldn't help but feel that same old insecurity creeping back in. Was she too boring for someone like him? He was a best-selling author, for crying out loud, a man whose life had been splashed across magazines and social media, who had probably dated models and actresses. What would someone like that see in a woman like her? She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. It didn't matter. She wasn't interested in starting anything with Evan. Not really. He was a customer, a friend, maybe. Nothing more. But even as she told herself that, Jasmine knew she was lying. There was something about him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on, that made her heart race whenever he was around. It wasn't just his looks, though those certainly didn't hurt. It was the way he seemed to get lost in the pages of a book, the way his eyes lit up when they talked about a favorite author, the way he carried himself with a kind of quiet sadness that made her want to reach out and comfort him. That scared her, because the last thing she wanted was to open her heart again, only to have it broken. The bell above the door jingled, pulling Jasmine out of her thoughts. She looked up to see Evan walking in, his coat dusted with a few stray leaves from the park. He smiled at her, though it didn't quite reach his eyes, and she felt a pang of concern. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft as he approached the counter. Evan shrugged, slipping his hands into his pockets. Yeah, just went for a walk, cleared my head a bit. Jasmine studied him for a moment, unsure whether to press or let it go. There was a heaviness about him today, more so than usual, and she couldn't help but feel that whatever was bothering him wasn't something a walk could fix. You know, she said carefully, if you ever want to talk about it, I'm a pretty good listener. Evan glanced at her, his ocean blue eyes searching hers for a long moment. He seemed to hesitate, as if weighing the decision to open up or retreat back into himself. Finally, he sighed and leaned against the counter. His posture relaxed, but his expression conflicted. It's just complicated, he said quietly. Life, I mean. Everything gets so damn complicated. Jasmine nodded. Tell me about it. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled only by the soft hum of the bookstore's heater and the occasional rustle of pages from a customer browsing nearby. It was a comfortable kind of silence, though, one that didn't need to be filled with words. Finally, Evan spoke again, his voice low. I had this life, this picture-perfect life that looked great on the outside. Best-selling books, the perfect girlfriend, the whole thing. But it was all just fake. None of it was real. Jasmine listened quietly, her heart aching for him. She knew that kind of pain, the kind that came from realizing the life you'd built wasn't what you thought it was. It's hard to let go of something like that, she said softly, even when you know it's not right for you. Evan nodded, his gaze distant. Yeah, it is. They stood in silence for a moment longer before Jasmine gently broke the tension with a small smile. Well, if it helps, I think you're doing just fine. Complicated life or not? Evan's lips twitched upward, just the faintest hint of a smile. Thanks. And in that moment, standing there in the soft glow of the bookstore's lights, surrounded by the smell of old paper and the warmth of autumn outside, Jasmine realized something. Maybe they were both a little broken, both carrying past hurts that were hard to let go of. But in that brokenness, there was something real, something worth exploring, even if it scared her. Chapter 4. The Turning Point. It was a quiet evening at Serendipity Books, the kind of stillness that only came when autumn settled in for the night. The bookstore was bathed in a soft amber glow from the string lights Jasmine had hung along the shelves, giving the space a cozy warmth. Outside, the wind gently rustled the leaves, sending them swirling through the air like a dance of golden confetti. It was one of those perfect moments when time seemed to stretch and breathe, inviting a sense of calm that Jasmine had always cherished. The shop had cleared out for the evening, save for one person. As always, Evan was tucked into his usual spot in the reading nook, a stack of books beside him, a steaming mug of apple cider on the table. But tonight, there was something different. He wasn't reading or pretending to skim through a novel like he sometimes did when he wanted to avoid conversation. Instead, he sat staring out the window, lost in thought, his face half hidden in shadow. Jasmine finished closing up the shop for the day, taking her time to straighten the last few books on the shelves. She wasn't in a rush. There was no one waiting for her at home, and she had no pressing plans. And lately, she'd found herself lingering around the bookstore more when Evan was there. His presence was quiet, unobtrusive, but comforting in a way she hadn't expected. With a soft sigh, Jasmine wiped her hands on her apron and made her way to the reading nook. Apple cider refill? She offered with a small smile, holding up the pot. Evan glanced up, blinking as if he hadn't realized she was there. He smiled faintly, nodding. Sure, thanks. Jasmine poured the warm, spiced drink into his cup and settled into the armchair across from him. She didn't say anything at first, simply letting the comfortable silence hang between them. The bookstore always felt different at night. Quieter, more intimate. She loved it. "So, what's on your mind?" she asked after a moment, her tone casual but inviting. Evan looked down at his cider, swirling it around in the mug as he seemed to consider her question. For a long moment, she thought he might brush it off like he usually did, offer a shrug and a non-committal answer. But tonight, something in his expression shifted. He seemed tired. Not physically, but emotionally, as though carrying a weight too heavy for too long. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," he began, his voice low. "About letting go of something, even when you know it's not right for you." Jasmine nodded, leaning forward slightly in her chair. "Yeah?" Evan took a slow breath, his gaze still focused on the cider in his hands. "My breakup. With Danielle. I guess I never really talked about it with anyone. Not the real stuff, anyway. Everyone saw the headlines, they saw the pictures, but no one actually asked me what happened." He paused, glancing up at Jasmine. "I guess I didn't let them." Jasmine's heart softened as she listened. She knew how it felt to keep things bottled up, to protect yourself from the vulnerability that came with sharing your deepest pain. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready," she said gently. "But I'm here if you want to." Evan met her eyes, and for the first time, Jasmine saw something raw in his gaze, something unguarded. "It wasn't that it ended," he said quietly. "It's how it ended, how public it was. Everything about our relationship was on display, and when it fell apart, so did I. I was so wrapped up in what people thought, in how it looked from the outside, that I forgot about what really mattered. By the time I realized it, we were both strangers." Jasmine felt a pang of sympathy, her chest tightening as she imagined what that must have been like for him, living under the scrutiny of strangers who thought they had a right to judge. "That sounds exhausting," she said softly. "It was," Evan admitted. "Danielle and we weren't right for each other, but we kept pretending like we were because it was easier. Easier to play the part than to face the truth." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And when it ended, I couldn't write anymore. It was like all the things I used to feel. Passion, inspiration, whatever you want to call it. It just disappeared." Jasmine nodded, understanding more than he knew. She had been in a relationship like that once too, where you go through the motions because it feels safer than the truth. And when it ended, she had felt lost for a long time, wondering if she was the problem, if she was too content with her quiet life to keep someone like Richard interested. "I get that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I stayed with someone longer than I should have too. It wasn't a big public thing, but it still hurt. I guess I thought if I was enough, he'd understand why I loved my life the way it is. But he never did. He wanted more excitement, more adventure. And I just wanted this." She gestured around the cozy bookstore, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I wanted peace." Evan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he studied her. "You never seem boring to me," he said quietly, his voice sincere. Jasmine's heart did a little flip at his words, and she looked down, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're just saying that because I keep recommending the best books," she teased lightly, though her voice held a soft edge of emotion. "No," Evan said, his tone firm but gentle. "I mean it. I didn't come to Ashwood Falls just to get away from the city. I came because I needed this." He mirrored her gesture, indicating the bookstore, the quiet, the simple life she cherished. "I needed to feel normal again, and you've helped with that." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. There was something in his eyes, something raw and real, that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in a long time. She wasn't used to this, to someone looking at her like she was enough, just as she was. Her instinct was to pull back, to protect herself from the vulnerability of the moment. But something about the way Evan spoke, the honesty in his voice, made her stay. "You've helped me too," she admitted softly. "I didn't realize how much I'd closed myself off after Richard. I guess I thought it was safer to stay in my little bubble, with my books and my routines. But I've liked having you around." Evan smiled, and this time it was a real smile, one that reached his eyes. "I've liked being around." For a moment, they just looked at each other, the quiet between them filled with an unspoken understanding. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about the connection they were building, something fragile but real, something that had the potential to be more if they let it. As the evening stretched on, their conversation drifted from heartbreak to books, to the things that made them feel alive again. Jasmine found herself laughing more easily, sharing stories about her childhood spent in the bookstore with her grandmother, the way she used to hide under the counter with a stack of books, losing herself in worlds far away from Ashwood Falls. Evan, in turn, talked about his writing process, the way he used to stay up late into the night, typing away at his laptop, fueled by coffee and inspiration. It was the most personal conversation they'd ever had, and by the end of it, they both felt lighter, like the weight of their pasts had loosened its grip, just a little. Jasmine glanced at the clock and realized how late it had gotten. "I should probably lock up soon," she said with a small smile, though part of her didn't want the night to end. Evan stood, stretching his arms above his head before offering her a hand. "I'll help you close up." Jasmine hesitated for a moment, then took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. The warmth of his touch sent a small thrill through her, and she quickly busied herself with turning off the lights and tidying up, trying to ignore the fluttering in her chest. Once the store was locked up, they stepped outside into the cool night air. The streets of Ashwood Falls were quiet, the occasional flicker of streetlights casting soft shadows on the pavement. "Thanks for tonight," Evan said, shoving his hands into his pockets as they stood together on the sidewalk. "I think I needed that." Jasmine smiled, hugging her arms around herself to ward off the chill. "Me too." They stood in silence for a moment, the cool breeze rustling the leaves around them. Evan glanced down at her, his expression soft but unreadable. "You know, I think I'm ready to start writing again." Jasmine's heart lifted at his words. "Really?" "Yeah," he said, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Being here, with you, it's helped. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like I can breathe again." Jasmine felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling of quiet pride. She had helped him, just by being herself, by offering the peace she had always found in the simple things. "I'm glad," she said softly. Evan looked at her for a long moment, then reached out, gently tucking a strand of her hair behind her ear. His touch was light, almost hesitant, but the gesture sent a shiver down her spine. "Good night, Jasmine." "Good night, Evan," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. As he walked away, disappearing into the night, Jasmine stood there for a moment, watching the shadows of the leaves dance on the ground. She felt a shift deep inside her, a turning point, a new beginning. For the first time in a long time, she was ready to take a chance. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something real. Chapter 5. Conflict and Distance. The golden days of autumn continued to pass in Ashwood Falls, and with each one, Jasmine felt herself growing more entangled in something she hadn't expected. Evan Bennett had become more than just a quiet presence at Serendipity Books. His visits had shifted from casual drop-ins to something deeper: late-night conversations, inside jokes, and the way he looked at her, like she was someone worth knowing. But with every step closer they took, a voice in the back of Jasmine's mind whispered doubts she couldn't shake. This was temporary, wasn't it? Evan was still Evan Bennett, the best-selling author with a life in the spotlight, no matter how much he tried to retreat from it. And she was just Jasmine, the bookstore owner content in her small town, in her quiet routines. So, as much as she found herself wanting to trust him, to lean into the connection they had, the fear of what might happen when his novel was finished crept into her thoughts more and more. What if he left? What if this was just another stop for him on the way to something bigger? And then, just as her worries were beginning to build, she showed up. It was a Wednesday afternoon when everything shifted. The air outside had turned colder, the first real bite of winter making itself known. Jasmine was behind the counter, wrapping up an order for a regular customer, when the doorbell jingled and a gust of wind rushed in with a tall, striking woman who immediately drew attention. She was dressed head to toe in designer clothing, a tailored camel coat, sleek black boots, and sunglasses perched on top of her flawless caramel-colored hair. Jasmine's heart sank the moment she saw her. She didn't have to guess. This had to be her, Danielle, the ex. Jasmine's throat tightened as the woman scanned the bookstore with a practiced air of nonchalance, her perfectly manicured fingers casually tapping the edge of her purse. The customer Jasmine had been helping finished paying and left, giving a friendly wave that Jasmine barely registered. Danielle's gaze zeroed in on her, a slow, calculating smile tugging at her lips as she approached the counter. "Hi there," she said, her voice smooth and dripping with confidence. "I'm looking for Evan Bennett. This is his favorite little hideaway, isn't it?" Jasmine swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the book she'd been holding. She forced herself to stand tall, even though her stomach was churning. "He's not here right now." Danielle gave a small, amused laugh. "Of course he's not. He wouldn't want me to show up unannounced, would he?" She leaned forward as though she and Jasmine were sharing a secret. "I didn't mean to surprise him. Or you." Jasmine felt a surge of protectiveness rise in her chest. She didn't like the way Danielle was looking at her, as if she was some obstacle in her way, someone to be brushed aside. "If you're looking for Evan, maybe you should call him directly," Jasmine said, keeping her voice as calm as she could. "But if you're just here to stir things up, this isn't the place for it." Danielle's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, sweetie, I'm not here to cause any trouble. Evan and we go way back. He'll want to see me." She gave a small, dismissive wave of her hand. "Besides, what's a little trip down memory lane between old flames?" The words hit Jasmine like a punch to the gut. Old flames. The phrase made her feel like an outsider, like she didn't belong in Evan's world. She hated how easily Danielle made her feel small, and she hated how much she was letting it get to her. Just then, the door jingled again, and before Jasmine could say another word, Evan walked in. His eyes widened when he saw Danielle standing at the counter, and for a moment, the tension in the room became palpable. "Danielle?" His voice was laced with surprise, but Jasmine couldn't tell if it was a welcome surprise or a wary one. Danielle turned, her face lighting up in what looked like practiced charm. "Evan, there you are. I've been looking all over for you." She took a step toward him, her arm outstretched, like she was about to pull him into some intimate reunion. But Evan didn't move. In fact, he stayed rooted to the spot, his expression quickly shifting from shock to something harder, something colder. "What are you doing here?" His voice had lost all of its warmth. Danielle blinked, clearly thrown by his tone. "I just wanted to see you. We didn't exactly leave things on the best of terms, and I thought maybe we could talk. Catch up." She smiled, her eyes flicking briefly toward Jasmine, as though sizing up her competition. "You know, just the two of us." Evan's jaw tightened. "We have nothing to talk about, Danielle. You made it clear how you felt when you ended things the way you did. There's nothing left between us." Jasmine felt a rush of relief wash over her, but it was quickly followed by a wave of uncertainty. She hadn't expected Evan to be so firm, so direct, but it also left her wondering how much of this conversation was for her benefit, and how much of it was genuine. Danielle, however, wasn't ready to give up. She took another step closer to Evan, her voice lowering to something softer, more coaxing. "Come on, Evan. We had some good times. You don't really want to throw that all away, do you? I've been thinking, maybe we could try again. You and me." Evan took a deep breath, and Jasmine watched as his eyes flicked to her, just for a second, before turning back to Danielle. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "There's no you and me anymore, Danielle. That chapter is over. I'm in a different place now, and I'm not interested in going back." Danielle's smile faltered, and for the first time, Jasmine saw a flicker of uncertainty in her perfect, polished exterior. "Is that so?" she asked, her gaze flicking between Evan and Jasmine. "And I suppose she has something to do with that?" The air seemed to thicken, and for a split second, Jasmine's heart seized. She could feel Danielle's eyes boring into her, the accusation clear. But before she could say anything, Evan stepped forward, blocking Danielle's view of her. "Jasmine has nothing to do with this," he said firmly. "This is about me and what I want, and what I want has nothing to do with you anymore." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Danielle's eyes narrowed, her polished exterior cracking just a little as she realized she wasn't going to get the response she had hoped for. She looked at Evan one last time, her jaw clenched, then turned on her heel and stalked out of the bookstore, the doorbell jingling sharply behind her. For a long moment, neither Jasmine nor Evan spoke. The room felt too quiet, too still after the storm that had just passed. Jasmine stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do. She felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, disbelief, and a lingering unease that she couldn't quite shake. Evan let out a slow breath and ran a hand through his hair, clearly rattled by the encounter. "I'm sorry," he said, turning to face her. "That was unexpected." Jasmine nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, she's intense." He gave a humorless laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's one word for it." But beneath the light exchange, Jasmine could feel the tension still simmering between them. She didn't know how to bring it up, how to say what was weighing on her heart. Instead, she found herself stepping back, putting a little more distance between them than usual. "Do you think she's really gone?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Evan frowned, sensing the shift in her tone. "Yeah, she's gone. She won't be coming back." But that wasn't what Jasmine had meant. She wasn't worried about Danielle coming back to the bookstore. She was worried about Evan leaving. She was worried that this, whatever this was between them, was temporary. That once his novel was finished, once he had what he needed, he would pack up and leave just like Danielle had. And in that moment, Jasmine felt herself pulling back. She couldn't help it. The doubts, the fears, the insecurity, all of it flooded her, and she wasn't sure she could handle getting too close to someone who could walk away so easily. Evan noticed. His brows furrowed as he stepped closer, reaching out as if to close the gap between them. "Jasmine," he said softly, "you don't have to worry about her. That part of my life is over. It's done." Jasmine swallowed, her throat tight. "I know," she said, though her voice didn't quite sound like her own. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that he was here, with her, for the right reasons. But there was a part of her, still wounded from her past, that couldn't shake the fear that this would end just like everything else. "I'm not Danielle," he said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "I'm not going to leave you hanging." She looked up at him, her heart aching with a mix of hope and fear. "How do I know that, Evan? How do I know this isn't just temporary?" Evan's gaze softened, and he reached out, gently taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, steady, and for the first time that night, Jasmine felt a flicker of calm. "Because I'm here," he said, his voice low but sure. "And I'm not going anywhere." Jasmine searched his eyes, looking for any sign of doubt, but all she found was sincerity. Slowly, she let herself breathe again, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little. But even as she stood there, holding his hand, she knew that trusting him would take time, and she wasn't sure how much more of her heart she was willing to risk. Chapter 6. The Book Club Event. The day of the annual Autumn Book Club arrived, and Serendipity Books was buzzing with energy. The normally quiet bookstore had transformed into a cozy hub of activity, the scent of spiced apple cider wafting through the air, mingling with the earthy smell of old pages. Twinkling fairy lights were draped across shelves, and the warm hues of autumn leaves filled every corner, making the bookstore feel like a scene straight out of a storybook. Jasmine stood near the back counter adjusting a tray of pumpkin cookies for the third time, her nerves starting to get the best of her. Hosting the book club event had always been one of her favorite traditions, a gathering where people from all over town came together to talk about stories they loved, but this year felt different, more significant. Evan was going to be there, and suddenly, it felt like everything mattered a little more. She glanced at the door, half expecting Evan to walk in at any moment. She hadn't seen him much since the encounter with Danielle, and though he had reassured her that his ex was no longer a part of his life, there had been a lingering tension between them. She had pulled back, and she knew it. It wasn't that she didn't believe him. It was that she didn't trust herself. She didn't trust her heart to survive another hit. "Jasmine? Are you okay?" A familiar voice called, interrupting her spiral of thoughts. Jasmine turned to see Mrs. Turner, the elderly romance novel aficionado, peering at her over the top of her glasses. She was holding a plate of cookies, a mischievous smile on her face. "Oh, yeah," Jasmine said, brushing a curl behind her ear. "Just making sure everything's perfect." Mrs. Turner gave a knowing nod. "Honey, it's always perfect here. Now, stop fussing with those cookies before you drive yourself crazy." Jasmine couldn't help but laugh. "You're right. I'm just a little on edge tonight." "Is it because of that handsome author of yours?" Mrs. Turner teased, her eyes twinkling. "I saw him the other day, looking all broody and mysterious. I bet half the women in this town are waiting for him to sweep them off their feet." Jasmine felt her face flush. "He's not my author," she said quickly. "He's just Evan." "Mm-hmm," Mrs. Turner replied, clearly not convinced. "Well, whatever you call him, I hope he's reading something at the event tonight. I've been dying to hear a real author read from his work." Jasmine's stomach did a small flip at the thought. She hadn't even considered asking Evan to read something. Would he be up for it? And what would it mean if he did? Before she could dwell on it any longer, the door jingled, and Evan stepped inside. He was wearing a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, his hair slightly tousled from the autumn wind. His blue eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on Jasmine, a small, hesitant smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Jasmine felt her heart skip a beat. There was something about the way he looked at her, like he saw right through all the walls she'd built, and yet he was still there, still choosing to stay. It terrified her and comforted her in equal measure. "Hey," Evan said, softly, as he approached, his voice cutting through the chatter of the other guests. "Hey," Jasmine replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "You made it." "Wouldn't miss it," he said, his gaze lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. There was a brief, awkward pause, filled with the unspoken things between them, before Evan cleared his throat. "So, are you ready for the big event?" Jasmine let out a nervous laugh. "I think so. I just hope everything goes smoothly." Evan smiled, that easy, calming smile she was starting to rely on. "It'll be great. You've got this." Before Jasmine could respond, Mrs. Turner sidled up to them, a wide grin on her face. "Oh, Evan! So glad you could join us. You are planning on reading something tonight, aren't you?" Evan blinked, clearly caught off guard. I hadn't really planned on it." "Oh, nonsense," Mrs. Turner waved a hand. "You're a writer, for heaven's sake. We've got to hear something from you. Right, Jasmine?" Jasmine hesitated, her eyes darting between Mrs. Turner and Evan. She didn't want to pressure him, but the idea of hearing Evan read something, a piece of himself, felt important. It felt like a step toward something more. "Only if you're comfortable," Jasmine said, giving him an out. Evan rubbed the back of his neck, clearly contemplating it. Then, after a moment, he gave a small nod. "Yeah. Okay. I think I've got something I can share." Mrs. Turner clapped her hands together, delighted. "Oh, this is going to be wonderful." As the evening unfolded, the bookstore buzzed with the warmth of laughter and conversation. The book club members discussed everything from classic novels to guilty pleasure reads, the atmosphere as light as the twinkling lights overhead. Jasmine floated between conversations, checking on guests, refilling cider, and sneaking glances at Evan, who seemed to blend into the crowd effortlessly, chatting with various attendees and offering thoughtful commentary on the books they discussed. But as the night drew to a close, the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. Jasmine stood at the front of the room, her hands clasped in front of her as she addressed the group. "I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. It means a lot to see so many familiar faces and a few new ones, too." She glanced at Evan, her heart fluttering. "And we're especially lucky tonight, because we have a very special guest who's agreed to share a little something with us." There was a soft murmur of excitement as all eyes turned to Evan. He looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention, but he smiled politely and made his way to the front of the room. Jasmine stepped aside, giving him the floor, her heart thudding in her chest as she wondered what he would choose to read. Evan cleared his throat, holding a small notebook in his hands. "Thanks for having me tonight," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight of vulnerability. "I've been working on something new, and it's still rough, but I think it fits the spirit of tonight." Jasmine's breath caught as she watched him open the notebook, his eyes scanning the page before he began to read. "It's funny how life can take you by surprise," he began, his voice low and steady. "You think you know where you're going, what you're supposed to do. But then something, or someone, comes along and changes everything. Suddenly, you're faced with a choice. Do you stay in the safety of what you've always known, or do you take the risk, step into the unknown, and see what happens?" The room was silent, everyone hanging on his every word, but Jasmine could barely hear anything beyond the thudding of her own heart. She could feel the weight of his words pressing on her, as if they were meant just for her. "Sometimes it's easier to hold on to the past," Evan continued, his voice softening. "It's easier to carry the fear of getting hurt again, to keep the walls up and stay where it's safe. But the thing is, if you never let go, you never get to see what's on the other side. You never get to see what could happen if you just let yourself believe in something new." Jasmine's breath hitched, her eyes fixed on him as he spoke. He wasn't just reading from his book. He was speaking to her, directly, clearly, and with a rawness that struck deep. I think sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let go of the fear, to trust that maybe, just maybe, something better is waiting for us. A new beginning. A fresh start. He closed the notebook, his eyes lifting to meet Jasmine's across the room. For a moment, everything else faded away. The crowd, the bookstore, the world outside. And it was just the two of them, standing on the edge of something terrifying and wonderful. Jasmine's chest felt tight, her emotions a whirlwind. She knew what he was saying, what he was offering her. But was she ready to take it? Could she let go of her fear, her doubts, and trust in this new beginning? The room erupted into applause, but Jasmine barely registered it. Her mind was spinning, her heart racing. And as Evan stepped away from the front, making his way toward her, she knew that whatever happened next, it was going to change everything. Chapter 7. A New Beginning. The applause from the book club event had faded, leaving a gentle hum in the air as the last few guests made their way out of Serendipity Books. Jasmine stood by the counter, her hands resting lightly on the wood, her heart still racing from Evan's reading. His words had resonated deeply, each line laced with a truth she hadn't been ready to face until now. Everything he had said had been for her, and the weight of it pressed down on her in the most beautiful, terrifying way. Outside, the wind sent the last of the autumn leaves tumbling down the street, swirling in a dance that felt both chaotic and graceful. Inside, the bookstore was bathed in the soft glow of the twinkling fairy lights, casting a warm, golden hue over the shelves, and the familiar scent of worn paper and cinnamon still hanging in the air. It was a scene Jasmine knew well, one she had found comfort in countless times before. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight it felt like the world was waiting for her to decide what came next. Evan was still standing near the window, his silhouette framed by the soft light filtering in from the street. His eyes met hers across the room, and for a moment, everything else faded away. There was no more chatter, no more noise, just the two of them, locked in the quiet that followed his confession. His words hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Jasmine's heart thudded in her chest as she slowly walked toward him, each step filled with a mix of excitement and fear. She wasn't sure what she was about to say, or how to even begin to unpack everything swirling inside her. But she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep running from this. From him. From them. When she finally reached him, she stood just a few feet away, close enough to feel the warmth of his presence, but still far enough that the space between them held a kind of electric tension. "You're reading tonight," she began softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It felt personal. Evan gave a small, almost bashful smile, his hands sliding into his pockets. It is. Jasmine swallowed, her throat tight. "Were you talking about me?" His eyes softened, and without a moment of hesitation, he stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "Every word, Jasmine. Every single word." The air seemed to shift around them, the room growing impossibly still as Jasmine tried to gather her thoughts. She had spent so much time building walls around herself, convinced that letting someone in would only lead to disappointment. And yet, here Evan was, offering her something real, something honest. He wasn't asking her to change or be anything other than who she was. He wasn't offering grand gestures or dramatic promises, but something better. Truth. "I've been so scared," Jasmine admitted, her voice wavering with the weight of her confession. "I didn't think I could trust this. Or you. Not after Richard. Not after feeling like I wasn't enough for him. I convinced myself that you'd leave too. That once you finished your book, you'd go back to your life, and I'd be right where I started. Evan's expression softened, and he took another step forward, his voice gentle but unwavering. I'm not going anywhere, Jasmine. I'm not Richard. I don't want the life I had before. I want something different. I want this. His hand gestured between them, the space that held everything they hadn't yet said. I want you. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat as his words settled over her like the first snow of winter. Soft, surprising, but welcome. But your life, she said, her voice quiet but laced with uncertainty. It's so different from mine. You're this big author, and I'm just here, in this small town, with my little bookstore. Evan shook his head, his gaze intense but full of warmth. You keep saying just like it's a bad thing. But Jasmine, you're not just anything. You're everything. This place? You've reminded me what matters. You've given me back something I didn't even know I'd lost. She felt a lump form in her throat, her emotions swirling as the truth of his words began to sink in. For so long, she had convinced herself that her life wasn't enough, that her quiet world wasn't what someone like Evan would want. But here he was, standing in front of her, choosing this life. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go of the fear that had kept her so tightly wound. I'm tired of running, Evan said softly, his hand reaching out to gently brush a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was warm, grounding her in the moment. I've spent too long holding on to things that don't matter. You've made me see that. You've made me see that there's more to life than what I thought I wanted. Jasmine's heart swelled, her chest tight with the emotions she had been trying to suppress. It felt like a dam had broken inside her, all the fear and doubt washing away in the face of something she couldn't deny any longer. This was real. He was real. And I want to stay, Evan continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. Not just to finish my book, not just for the peace of Ashwood Falls. I want to stay because of you. Because with you, I feel like I've found a place I didn't even know I was looking for. Jasmine's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't from fear or sadness. They were from the overwhelming sense of hope and possibility that now filled her. She had spent so long guarding herself against getting hurt. But here, in this moment, she realized something. She didn't need to be afraid anymore. Maybe, just maybe, she could trust this new beginning. Without thinking, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Her hand found his, their fingers intertwining like they had always belonged together. I want that too, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. I want you to stay. Evan's smile grew, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made her heart flutter. He gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a stray tear as he leaned in, his lips inches from hers. Then let's start again, he whispered. No more fear. Just us. And with that, he kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, like the start of a new chapter. But as their lips pressed together, the kiss deepened, filled with all the things they hadn't said, all the emotions they had been too afraid to show. It was a kiss that spoke of hope, of new beginnings, of letting go of the past and embracing what was right in front of them. When they finally pulled away, their foreheads resting gently against each other, the bookstore felt impossibly quiet, like the world outside had paused just for them. The soft glow of the autumn lights flickered through the window, casting a warm, golden hue over the shelves. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jasmine felt at peace. She looked up at Evan, her heart full, her mind clear. So, what now? She asked, her voice playful but full of genuine curiosity. Evan chuckled, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. Now? Now? We take it one day at a time. No rush, no pressure. Just us, figuring it out together. Jasmine smiled, a sense of calm settling over her as she looked around the bookstore, the place that had always been her sanctuary, her safe haven. It was still all of those things, but now it felt like more. It felt like the beginning of something new, something real. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's warmth, the last of the autumn leaves fell outside, swirling gently to the ground, making way for what was to come. And in that moment, Jasmine realized something. Autumn wasn't just about the leaves falling. It was about shedding what no longer served you, about letting go of the old to make room for the new. It was about trusting that the seasons would change, and that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings came after the quietest endings.